Three specialists, flown in from 3 different states at considerable expense, had spent 6 days failing to diagnose why the Liberty wouldn't hold a stable idle. And Gus Reinhold had been standing in the doorway of the Iron Valves restoration barn for exactly 4 minutes before he'd heard enough. "Move aside, son," Gus said, aiming the words at whichever specialist happened to be nearest the bike. "I built this engine's grandfather with my own 2 hands. I know exactly what it's trying to tell you, if you'd stop listening for what your instruments expect, and start listening for what it's actually doing." The lead specialist, a well-credentialed engine consultant named Dr. Marcus Feld, who charged more per day than most people made in a month, looked at the frail 90-year-old man in the doorway, cane in one hand, being guided by his great-grandson's arm in the other, and made no effort to hide his skepticism. "With respect," Feld said, "we've run full diagnostics with equipment considerably more precise than an old blind man's ears," Gus said. "I know. I've heard that sentence in one form or another for 20 years now. Doesn't make it true." What happened over the following 20 minutes would end with 216 motorcycles filling the road outside Thornberry, Wisconsin, at a rescheduled unveiling that finally had something worth celebrating. And 3 expensive specialists learning that a factory floor in 1954 had taught a young engineer things no modern diagnostic software had ever been built to measure. Thornberry sat 40 minutes outside Milwaukee, close enough to Harley-Davidson's historic manufacturing district that half the town's older residents had spent some portion of their working lives on that factory floor. And the Iron Valves National Chapter had built a dedicated restoration barn on the edge of town specifically to house and maintain the Liberty, a one-of-a-kind 1953 prototype racer built for an early land speed record attempt, later gifted to the club's most legendary founding rider, and valued today by the collectors and historians who tracked such things at just over $2 million. The bike was scheduled to be unveiled publicly for the first time in a decade at the chapter's 75th anniversary celebration, a date now 6 days away and increasingly in jeopardy since the Liberty's engine had developed a stubborn, unexplained idle instability during routine pre-event servicing. Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next 20 minutes weren't only about fixing an engine 3 experts had already failed to understand. They were about the difference between reading an engine's specifications and actually knowing, from decades of having built one with your own hands, exactly how it was meant to breathe. Now, back 71 years, to the Harley-Davidson factory floor where a 19-year-old Gus Reinhold first learned to build engines by feel. Gus Reinhold had started at the Harley-Davidson factory in Milwaukee in 1954. A 19-year-old apprentice assigned to the small experimental engineering team developing high-performance variants for record attempts, working directly under 2 senior engineers who'd personally designed the engine architecture the Liberty's own motor had been built from. Gus had spent 4 years on that team before being drafted, learning to diagnose a running engine by vibration and sound with a precision that had, decades later, transferred seamlessly into his life after glaucoma took his sight permanently at 68. He'd spent those 4 factory years obsessing over exactly the kind of prototype engineering the Liberty represented, and had, in fact, worked directly on an earlier prototype in the same experimental line before the war interrupted his engineering career entirely. His great-grandson, Tyler, a first-year prospect with the Iron Vow, had mentioned the Liberty's stalled restoration at a family dinner purely as an interesting anecdote, and had been startled when his 90-year-old great-grandfather set down his fork and asked, with sudden and complete focus, exactly what engine architecture the Liberty used. "That's my engine," Gus had said, once Tyler described the specifications. "I mean that literally. I helped design the block those specifications came from." Tyler had arranged the visit within 2 days, uncertain whether his great-grandfather's insistence reflected genuine expertise or an old man's nostalgic overconfidence, and had been considerably reassured, watching Gus navigate the restoration barn with quiet, practiced confidence, despite having never set foot inside it before. The three specialists had each approached the problem the way modern engine diagnostics typically did. Computer analysis of ignition timing, compression testing across all cylinders, fuel delivery systems checked and rechecked against factory specifications pulled from digitized archives. Every test came back within acceptable parameters, and yet the engine continued to surge and drop at idle in a pattern none of their equipment could explain. Because the equipment had been calibrated against modern engine architecture rather than the specific, hand-fitted tolerances of a one-off 1953 prototype built before standardized manufacturing had fully caught up to experimental engineering. "The problem isn't in anything your computers are measuring," Gus said, walking slowly toward the bike with Tyler's steadying hand at his elbow. "It's in something they were never built to measure at all." He placed both palms flat against the engine casing, the same gesture he'd used 70 years earlier as a teenage apprentice, learning to trust his hands over any gauge available to him, and asked for the engine to be started. Dr. Feld, exchanging a glance with his two colleagues that suggested he was humoring an old man mostly out of politeness, nodded for the mechanic to proceed. The engine caught, ran rough for several seconds, then surged unpredictably exactly the way it had for 6 days running. Gus stood motionless through the whole cycle, his hands never leaving the casing, his head tilted slightly in the particular attitude of a man listening past the obvious sound toward something underneath it. "There," Gus said, after the engine had cycled through its surge twice more. "The compensator spring behind the primary drive. It's original to the bike, isn't it? Not a modern replacement?" Feld checked his notes, his confidence faltering slightly. "It's listed as original equipment, yes. 1953 tolerances weren't what they became even 5 years later," Gus said. "That spring was hand-fitted to compensate for a slight irregularity in this specific block's casting. Something the original engineers noted only in a private logbook, never in the official specifications your diagnostics would have pulled. Over 70 years, that spring's tension has drifted just enough to throw off the compensation it was built to provide. Your equipment sees a spring within acceptable modern tolerance. It doesn't know this particular spring was never built to modern tolerance in the first place." The silence that followed lasted long enough that the mechanic operating the bike glanced uncertainly between Gus and the three specialists, uncertain whose instruction to follow. "That's not documented anywhere," Feld said, quiet now, considerably less certain than he'd sounded 5 minutes earlier. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I was standing next to the engineer who wrote that logbook entry," Gus said. 71 years ago, in a factory that doesn't exist in the same form anymore, keeping notes nobody ever digitized, because nobody left alive knew they mattered until now." Feld examined the compensator spring himself, measuring its current tension against factory specification for the first time, with an eye toward exactly what Gus had described rather than what standard diagnostics expected to find, and confirmed within minutes a discrepancy subtle enough that none of their prior testing had flagged it as significant. "He's right," Feld said to his colleagues, in a tone that had shed every trace of its earlier skepticism. "It's been within our measured tolerance the whole time. It was never supposed to be within our tolerance. It was supposed to be within his." Word of what had happened in that restoration barn moved through the Iron Vow fast, the particular story that needed no exaggeration to land with its full weight. A 90-year-old blind veteran had solved, through 71 years of institutional memory no database had ever captured, a problem that 3 of the country's most credentialed engine specialists had failed to touch in 6 full days. The compensator spring was hand-adjusted to the exact tension Gus specified, tested through 4 consecutive clean idle cycles, and confirmed stable enough for the anniversary unveiling to proceed as originally scheduled, 6 days later than the crisis had briefly threatened. Engines first, and then chrome filling the road outside Thornbury as the anniversary morning spread gold over the Wisconsin farmland. 216 motorcycles rolling in from every chapter within reach. Riders who'd heard one story about a blind man's 71-year-old memory succeeding where modern engineering equipment had failed. Engines dying in sequence until Thornbury held nothing but the tick of 216 cooling engines and a silence deep enough that the Liberty's own engine note, idling steady on the display stand, carried clearly across the entire gathered crowd. Not one rider there had come only to see a famous motorcycle. They'd come because a story like Gus's, once heard, made an entire community want to witness the moment a lifetime of expertise finally got the recognition it deserved. Dr. Feld found Gus near the display stand and extended a hand Gus couldn't see but shook anyway once Tyler guided it toward him. "I've spent 30 years believing equipment could tell me everything an engine needed me to know," Feld said. 14 words. You corrected that assumption in 20 minutes. "Equipment measures what it was built to measure," Gus said. "It's not equipment's fault nobody thought to teach it what a 19-year-old apprentice learned by accident in 1954. Tyler, standing beside his great-grandfather throughout the anniversary ceremony, found himself, for the first time in his short prospect year, understanding exactly what kind of legacy he'd unknowingly been riding alongside his entire life. "You never told any of us you helped build this kind of engine," Tyler said. "Nobody ever asked," Gus said. "Until you mentioned it over dinner, and something in me remembered exactly how much I still had left to say about it. Gus visits the restoration barn every week now, consulting on every historic engine the chapter takes in, his great-grandson at his elbow, and a line of considerably humbled specialists occasionally calling ahead to ask his opinion before they'll commit to a diagnosis of their own. If this story reached you, if you believe that 70 years of institutional memory is worth more than any diagnostic equipment built to replace it, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that the most valuable expert in any room is sometimes the person everyone else assumed was too old to still matter. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, whose 70-year-old memory do you wish more people still asked about?